listening to the last closing words of the panel, I looked up a slide that I'm carrying around in a slide. I'm sort of collecting slides for giving presentations. I'm sure many of you do that, sort of climate ones, and I have one that I used in a presentation with a new office in the Foreign Ministry called the Office for Green Diplomacy, which basically is research done by a team at the University of Lund, I think, on what you, on a personal basis, can do to contribute to climate change. And it's sort of gone through, you know, everything from hanging dry clothes, recycling, replacing your car with a hybrid, eating a plant-based diet, buy green energy, living car-free, etc. Now, the number one on that list, which sort of by far outweighs all the others, 8 times combined, is having one less child. And the point of the research is that every child in the Western world has an average annual CO2 impact of about 56 tons, whereas, for example, the plant-based diet that we just talked about is about 0.8. And if you add not flying, having an electric car, and everything else together, the impact is about 7 to 8 tons. So just think about that in your personal choices. The talk about demography and climate change is often about children being born in other countries than our own. That's why I'm mentioning this. There's a lot of focus on demographic change in developing countries, but actually our own children also have a huge climate impact. We should just be aware of that when we start making this a developed and developing country issue. And I think part of the reason why the Danish government has chosen to appoint a climate ambassador and to create this post, which we haven't had before, is because we as Denmark want to have a more coherent approach to the way we go into the climate discussion. So institutionally, my position is both answering to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Development, which in Denmark is one integrated ministry, trade, but also climate and energy. So in a way, it's trying to bring all the various most important dimensions of climate change together into one, not person. I mean, I'm not important in this regard, but more institutionally trying to integrate the approach by saying this has to be an all-of-government approach. And in a way, the way Denmark is going about this, also an all-of-society approach. And I think you heard that from Jais Valeur, and he probably talked about the climate partnerships and the role that he's playing with the one on agriculture. But in fact, in this new approach of the new government, there have been created 13 climate partnerships with all the important sectors in the Danish economy. And that's a national thing that's happening in these partnerships with business. And I think our role in terms of international relations, once they come up with their recommendations and their pathways, will be to work with them on making sure that they are linked into the international debate in their value chains, which of course they know better than we do, but also make sure that, say, when the European Union does its Green Deal, that then is a sectoral approach to agriculture where we can actually plug the Danish efforts in, or maybe even use the Danish experience to lift the ambition level of, say, the European Union, or that we can take the agricultural efforts of this working group and talk to the UN, the FAO people. There are many different platforms where land use and agriculture is being discussed, and make sure that whatever efforts we're doing in Denmark actually is part of the wider global conversation. And similarly, actually, in the other 12 sectors, whether it's cement or steel or aviation or shipping or water or energy, this is not only a Danish conversation, but what we do in Denmark can actually have a huge impact in also catalyzing a global conversation. That's why I personally I understand why some critics say, well, it doesn't really matter what we do in this country. Our emissions are so small and it won't really change the world, whatever we do. But I think that's a bit missing the point, that actually by showing how action can be taken and how you can bring these partnerships of civil society, research, but also business and investors and the government, of course, how we can make that work together in a almost like a lab in Denmark that can then also inspire others to do the same at a much larger scale. Coincidentally, today, in parallel with this conference, over at the Foreign Ministry, there's a conference on shipping, where the whole value chain of shipping has been brought together, including some of the largest ship nations, shipping lines, but also shipbuilding companies, ports, fuel producers, into a conversation on how the value chain of shipping globally can, in a way, cooperate to create that global level playing field, which you can't do in one country alone. I mean, whatever regulation we do for Maersk in Denmark doesn't really mean anything unless Maersk has the same framework conditions in all the countries where they're active. And similar for I mean, Danish agricultural companies and others. You have to think it globally. But at least if we get our house in order in Denmark, then we have a solid platform to stand on to move forward. And in a way, the 70% emissions reduction target that we are now putting into law to be achieved by 2030, I see it as a way of internalizing the Paris Agreement in Denmark. We're in a way aligning the Danish society, Danish economy to the Paris target. We're probably the first country that is doing that, and in a way we will have to disrupt our own way of being a country in order to achieve it. But I do sense, and several people in this panel were talking about it, that there is a political will and a mobilization not only of young people, but actually also of all parts of Danish society to do that. And that's why I'm really excited about having been given this role. I played a role for a couple of years at the UN, where I worked with the Secretary General in the run-up to Paris. And our learning from the strategy of getting actually the Paris Agreement done, which was actually, in terms of diplomacy, a quite complicated effort given where we came from based on the climate meeting in Copenhagen in 2009. One of the sort of strategic tools that we applied was also one of the ones talked about here, that we tried to approach the climate challenge not only as a vertical one where countries each sort of decide we want to reduce emissions in our country. And some countries are more centrally organized than others, so they can decide it with the government. Actually, in Denmark, as you can see with the climate partnerships, there's a lot that the Danish government cannot decide, and which has to be done industry by industry. But we tried to break that sort of vertical way that countries are organized into these negotiations. That's how international relations work. And say, well, there's another dimension. There is the horizontal one. We have to bring the partners together in partnerships, in sectors that make sense, and where you, in a way, by creating that level pre-competitive playing field. And by the way, as some of the speakers before, I do think that capitalism has a role to play in saving the planet. It's actually about jiggering capitalism and getting the market forces to work and catalyzing those by making it a good business to save the planet and climate, that we can also make efforts. Of course, it has to be combined with regulation and helping the poor and the most marginalized so that it's a just transition, but it has to be a combination. Anyway, the partnerships that we catalyzed then, that approach has been taken into the climate process now, and when you have the annual climate meetings, there is a negotiation session, the negotiation track, but then in addition there is what's called the climate action space. And in Paris, there was a decision that every presidency of the climate negotiation should also appoint a climate champion. And in Marrakesh, the year after, there was a decision to have the Marrakesh action agenda. And that now has a separate space inside the annual climate meeting. One of the big challenges that we have as a global community is that we are so focused on the negotiation side. And every time the negotiations don't live up to expectations, we decry it as a big failure and we're going backwards. But just try to think about it. it's almost an illusion to think that we can negotiate our way into a global disruption of the global economy. That's not how the world works. What we can do as a global community is to agree on a certain set of rules, a certain set of targets, and then try to implement that as good as we can. But the truth is that if you add up all the national climate plans that countries have, they show that we're not at all meeting the 1.5 to 2 degree target. I mean, we're on a 3 to 4 degree pathway. But if you add up everything that's happening in the market and in energy transition, the trajectory looks much better. And the fact is that the real economy of most countries is actually much more advanced than what's in the negotiations and what's agreed between governments. And there are many reasons for that. Tactical, negotiation, developed countries want to have more technology transfer, more money, and that's fair that they do. But that also means that what's reported into the process of the negotiations is actually underneath or below what's actually happening in the country. So while we still have a huge challenge, the picture is not as bad as it looks when you look at the negotiations. Actually, a lot of good is happening. And I would say in agriculture, to get back to the theme of this conference, in Denmark, we have increased our food production with more than 30% in the last 30 years, while we have lowered our emissions by 16%. And there's a lot of focus on food production, on healthy and sustainable and climate-friendly diets, reducing food loss and waste, and in a way of agriculture playing a major part in our emissions reductions, as Gijs Valeur was saying. And in doing so, I could also highlight what Danish Crown has been doing. Christian Hansen was also here, and they were ranked as the most sustainable company in 2019 and the most sustainable food company in 2020. There is a Stop Spild Mad movement that Selena has been pivotal in launching, and a lot of work is going on around food loss. Actually, at the Foreign Ministry, we will have a Food Loss Day on 12 March and on 29 September. That includes also the Danish embassies around the world, which was trying to do our small part. So in closing, let me just sort of on behalf of my ministry give a small shout out as a call to action, both on climate and the SDGs. We need countries to step up and transform food systems as part of their NDCs, their national climate plans, as we head towards Glasgow. Food systems need to be part of the NDCs. It cannot only be about energy or transport. We need research community to provide solutions, including in livestock breeding, crops, digitization, finance, business models, behavioral change. We need the international development community to work on agriculture and food, both international organizations, NGOs, but also donors. We need to work on go-to-market models, and we need to experiment with partnerships. We also need business, both to improve their efficiency, to work on the value chains, but also to come up with the investments needed. It's been calculated that implementing the SDGs related to food has a value of around $2.3 trillion, which is an astounding amount, per year by 2030. That's a 7-to-1 investment opportunity if you look at what's being invested. So unlocking the investments into food is key. Food represents about between 20 to 30% of the emissions reductions need globally, including actually in Denmark. And if you look at the solutions that we have in Denmark, our government and the Minister of Climate and Energy, Dan Jørgensen, has been repeatedly saying, we know how to get to 60% in Denmark, and in order to get to 70%, it is really in the food and agriculture sector that we need to improve, because we don't have all the solutions there yet. And I would say, as you engage going forward, coming up with solutions that include agriculture and livestock is extremely important. So in closing, let me just say, We need to make 2020 a year of high ambition and action. We need to do it with passion for saving the climate. My old boss, Ban Ki-moon, said we can never solve the planet if we're not passionate about it, and I very much believe that. So let's all make 2020 a year of ambition, and thank you very much for your attention.